Fate Be Changed, Chapter 3, Merida. Merida tried to lift her head, but it felt as heavy as the chain mail that hung from the suits of armor lining the halls of Castle Dunbrock. Twin throbs beat at either side of her head, the rhythmic thumping worse than any headache she's experienced before. The air was redolent of the forest, musty earth, and decomposing leaves. Thin blades of grass pressed against her cheek. She could feel them imprinting in her skin, but could not summon the strength or will to do anything about it. She needed rest, even though it felt as if she had been sleeping for a fortnight. And as much as she wanted to spend the rest of the day snoring atop her grassy bed, Merida knew she could not. She had to get home. Her parents would be wondering where she was. She mustered just enough resolve to push herself up from her prone position and into a kneeling one. She had to steady herself on a nearby boulder, the throbbing in her head intensifying as she attempted to stand. Merida clasped her head in her hands and discovered a chicken egg-sized bump near her right temple. She gingerly pressed around the tender flesh, pulling back fingers that were sticky with blood. "Well, that's just great," Merida groused. She looked down, noting the impression of her body had left in the grass. How long had she been lying there? She was lucky some wandering clansman had trampled her with his horse. Horse? Angus! "Angus!" Merida called. She moved on wobbly legs, trying to shake off the dregs of sleep. She had to find her horse. "Angus! Angus! Where are you?" Her already weak limbs shook in relief when she heard him neigh. Merida rushed toward the sound and found her horse hiding behind one of the menhirs. He was skittish at first, backing away from her. "You're well, boy," she said, trying to coax him from behind the stone, but he refused to leave its safety. She moved slowly toward him so to not spook him. "You're well," Merida said. She ran her hand along Angus's thick mane, grateful he'd started to calm down. As she comforted her horse, Merida noticed that something didn't seem quite right with the menhir. Frowning, she swiped her hand along the smooth, grassless surface. She could have sworn the bottom half of the stone towers had been covered in moss, the kind of moss that grew over time. The lack of moss in the menhirs was not the only thing that gave her pause. The trees also seemed different. Many of them were shorter, and their trunks were not nearly as wide as she remembered, and there were more of them standing. She was certain at least a dozen of the trees that now stood tall around the ring of stones had been on the ground. Their stumps had been covered with the same moss that covered the menhirs. Clearly she had hit her head quite hard after eating that blasted cake. "Come on, Angus," Merida said. She untied the bow she'd taken before leaving Castle Dunbrock and draped it across her chest. Then she tightened her grip on Angus's reins. "Let's go home." She had no doubts that her mother would be in a snit when she returned, but Merida did not care anymore. After all these hours on the cold ground, she could think of nothing better than standing before the warm fire that burned in her bedchamber. She ran her hands through her knotted hair and came up with several blades of grass. There was something better than standing before the fire. Soaking in a nice warm bath and washing the events of the day away, along with the grime, sounded heavenly. Merida tugged on Angus's reins, urging him to come along. She was still feeling somewhat dizzy and did not trust herself to climb atop the horse, especially after the way he had thrown her. She decided it would be better to make the first part of the journey on foot. She would mount Angus once they reached the glen, where the terrain was flatter and littered with fewer hazards. She started walking west toward home. At least she thought that was the way. She had never journeyed this far into the forest before, and after all the time that had passed since she'd stormed away from the castle in tears, she could not be sure she had not been turned around. Merida heard what sounded like thunder coming from somewhere in the distance. She looked to the sky, but it was clear. No sign of the thick, dark clouds that had previously cast threatening shadows. She stopped to listen and realized it was not thunder she had heard. It was horses. Thank goodness, Merida breathed a sigh of relief. It was probably members of Clan Macintosh. Their lands were the east of Dunbrock, so they likely traveled this route to return home. She would stop one of them and make sure she was indeed heading back to Castle Dunbrock. But as the party of horsemen drew near, Merida could see that their tartans were not the red and green of the Macintosh. In fact, the purple and orange tartan did not belong to any of the clans of their land. Hide, her instincts told her, and fast. Quickly tugging Angus behind the trunks of two trees growing closely together, she flattened her back against one of them, grimacing as a sharp piece of bark dug into her flesh where her gown had ripped. Her heart pounded as she listened to the mounted men drawing closer. These lands had not been seen invaders since her father was a young man, well before the neighboring clans had reached an alliance. If the trespassers were here to seize their kingdom, the Princess of Dunbrock would be a grand prize. She would not put herself in position to become a bargaining chip. But it would seem she didn't have to worry about being captured. The group of men rode right past her. Still, Merida waited several minutes longer before stepping out from behind the tree trunks. She needed to get home. She had to warn her father and the other chieftains about what she had seen. Their 4 clans were no longer enemies. They would band together to fight these marauders. And she would help. Adrenaline surged through Merida at the thought of using her skill with the bow and arrow to help save her kingdom from an attack. She could show her mother that she was good for something other than playing a lute or hosting a dinner, or being someone's wife. Merida gathered Angus's reins, invigorated by newfound purpose. She kept her eyes open for the landmarks she normally used to guide her when she came out for rides. She was bound to encounter the small hill that lay just beyond a group of boulders, or that massive tree with a trunk the size of 3 horses. She would often sit atop it, stop to sit underneath it. When feeling a bit whimsical, she would entertain herself by imagining it was as a horse for magical woodland creatures. But the more she walked, the less familiar the surroundings appeared. Had she been traveling in the wrong direction? She had never been on the other side of the forest, toward the lands where Clan Macintosh resided. Maybe she had been turned around and not realized it. Merida decided to stick to the course she had set upon. If she did reach Clan Macintosh dwellings, at least she would know that she needed to head to the opposite direction to make it back home. She looked up at the sky and realized the sun would be setting soon. She would have to rely on Lord Macintosh's hospitality for the night. Merida doubted he was feeling very hospitable after the way she had behaved toward his son, but there was nothing to be done about that now. No matter how upset he was, the chieftain would not turn away their kingdom's princess. He would direct his household to treat her with generosity and respect. Her mother, however, was a different story. Merida feared the queen's earlier ire was nothing compared to what she would face when she returned to Castle Dunbrock. After more than an hour of travel, the dense clusters of trees began to thin, an indication that she was drawing nearer to home dwellings. Her father had taught her that trees closest to the edge of the forest were the first to be chopped for firewood. Merida wasn't sure if her wobbly knees were due to the exhaustion or relief at the sight of a thatched roof. She quickened her paces, buoyed by the thought of getting some help and maybe a bite to eat. "Wait here, Angus," she said, tying the horse's reins around a tree trunk. "I promise to bring you an apple." She would have to rely on the charity of others on behalf of her horse as well, having bartered the only thing of virtue she'd carried with the woodcarver. The witch, Merida reminded herself. A witch who had sold her a faulty spell. If changing her fate meant getting lost in the forest, Merida wanted her pendant back. She gave Angus's neck a reassuring rub before she took off down the trampled path that led to the forest to the edge of the small burrow she had happened upon. The strong odors of drying animal hide, dung, and fish hit her before she had made it to the first structure. Merida tried not to judge the rudimentary architecture. But if this is how the Macintosh clan lived, she had every right to try to get out of marrying the oldest son. The villagers around Castle Dunbrock had stopped using heather and reed for their roofs a long time ago, but these seemed to be the materials of choice here. The buildings were squat and narrow. Several skinny horses drank from a trough that sat between a blacksmith shop and a butcher. Merida's mouth watered at the sight of the plucked pheasant on display. It made her long for the succulent dishes their cook prepared for their evening meals. She clutched her stomach. What she wouldn't give for a big bowl of mutton stew. She entered the butcher shop, but before she could speak, the man took one look at her and said, "Nay, lass, your kind not allowed. Get out." Her head snapped back at his rudeness. "I am out!" The man shoved her. "I do not care about all the new talk about peace. Your kind is not welcome here." He closed the heavy wooden door in her face. Merida was too shocked to form a response. Her people were rather informal, but never had anyone treated her so. And what did he mean by her kind? Was it because she was a girl? Were the Macintosh so backwards in their thinking that they did not believe women could buy meats? In what new talk of peace? The Macintosh and Dunbrock clan had forged their alliance when the Vikings invaded North Scotland. The only story her father told, even more than the one about the day he met his dear Eleanor, or when he faced Mor'du, was the story of how he saved the clans from the towering Nordic warriors who arrived in their huge boats, ready to conquer the land and all the people who resided in it. Maybe Merida should remind these Macintosh that they would not have businesses to kick her out if it not for her father. She raised her fist, preparing to knock on the door, but then decided it wasn't worth it. She did not want advice or pheasant from such a close-minded man. Instead, she ventured to the next shop, the cobbler, hoping for a better reception. The store was empty, but Merida could hear someone in the back. "Hello," she called. A woman came out carrying a broom. At least this one wasn't sweeping on its own. "Hello," Merida said again. "I am hoping you can help me find my way back to Dunbrock No, Dunbrock," the woman interrupted. She swept dirt towards Merida's feet. "Get out. You're not welcome here." "But," Merida started. A new thought suddenly darted across Merida's mind. The games. Of course, perhaps the villagers had already heard what had transpired at the Highland Games. Was that why they were treating her with such harshness? Because she didn't want to marry their chieftain's eldest son? "Out! Out!" the woman continued to shout. When Merida didn't move fast enough, the women attacked her with the broom, raising it high above her head. Merida quickly turned and raced for the exit. She ran out of the door and into the street. "I just need help getting home," she called. Several villagers stepped out of the various shops. Some poked their heads out of the windows. "Is that too much to ask?" Merida pleaded as she spun in a slow circle, begging these villagers to listen. Suddenly she locked eyes with a woman who stood just outside a small shop at the end of the short street. Even from a distance, Merida could see that she had a bulbous nose that dominated her face. A dramatic look of silver ran through her long black hair. The sun's rays glinted off it, amplifying the conspicuous feature. Her intense gaze held Merida captive for a moment. She seemed familiar somehow, like they'd met in a dream once, and Merida tried to place her. Until the cobbler came out of her store, wielding her broom. "I told ye to go," the cobbler shouted. "We don't want no Dunbrock here." Merida darted up the street, back the way she had come. She scrambled through the brush and around the rocks protruding from the ground, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the broom-yielding shopkeeper. She was not sure what was going on, but the hostility coming from the Macintosh people seemed unwarranted. They could not be this upset because she had decided to participate in an archery competition herself. Then again, Merida was no stranger to the pride Scotsmen took in their clans standing within the kingdom. The villagers no doubt saw her rejection of the three eldest sons as rejection of their people. She had very likely made an enemy of every member of clans MacGuffin, Macintosh, and Dingwall. She had also made them enemies of the king and queen. Would the various clans become Merida's parents for their defiance? She had not fully considered the implications of her actions at the games. Her guilt grew as she took more time to ponder what she had done and the possible ramifications. "The damage is done," she muttered. There wasn't much she could do to change it, and certainly not now, while she was wandering the forest with no idea how to get back home. Satisfied that she had at least outmaneuvered the cobbler, Merida slowed her pace as she returned to the spot where she had left Angus. "Sorry, boy," she said, and that when she came upon her horse. "No apples." He neighed his discontent. As she suffered from the hunger pangs resonating throughout her own empty belly, Merida could not blame him. "I'll find something for us both," she said. She climbed onto her horse's back and guided him deeper into the woods, away from the village. As much as she loathed the prospect of sleeping out in this dense, unfamiliar area of the forest tonight, she disliked the thought of getting bashed in the head with a broomstick even more. Should she try to find that witch's cottage again? Merida wasn't sure she would make it back to the Ring of Stones before nightfall. That is, if she could ride at all without passing out from the hunger or the headache that continued to plague her. Lucky for her, King Fergus of Dunbrock was not as strict as his wife was when it came to his daughter's adhering to the rules that governed a princess's existence. Her father had taught her how to survive a night in the woods, much to her mother's chagrin. Merida closed her eyes and tried to picture the layout of the forest. A creek ran along the western edge. She looked up at the sky to gauge the position of the sun and guided Angus in the direction of where she thought they would find the fresh water. She heard a gurgling sound and excitedly tugged Angus's reins. "Come on, boy," she said. But then they came upon what should have been a wide creek. It was nothing more than a tiny brook. "This is odd," Merida said. She had fished in the creek during her many excursions over the years. Maybe the small brook was the start of it, which meant she was well north of Dunbrock, where the creek probably widened. That was the only explanation that made sense. "At least we have clean water," she said to her horse. Merida and Angus both drank their full from the brook. She had then used the water to freshen up, grimacing as she washed the caked dirt from her face and hands. She looked down at her dusty, torn gown. Was it any wonder the butcher and cobbler had shooed her off their businesses? Typically, she didn't care much about appearances, but even she had to admit she must have looked a fright. Gathering the hem of her gown, she dipped a tiny portion of it into the water. Then she gently dabbed at the knot on her head. Now that she had quenched her thirst, she needed to find something to fill her belly. The creek near Dunbrock was overflowing with salmon and trout, but this brook wasn't deep enough to sustain fish. Merida settled Angus near a patch of grass where he could eat, then crept along the trees and brush, seeking out something she could have for dinner. Out of nowhere, she heard a horse's strident blore, followed by a loud thump. Merida dropped to the forest floor. Her muscles tensed as sweat broke out across her forehead. Sucking in quick, shallow breaths, she closed her eyes and focused her attention on the area where the sound had come from. Several heartbeats later, she heard the clump, clump, clump of horse hooves again. She remained in the crouched position, hovering there until her knees quivered. Merida bit her lip. She was unwilling to risk being seen by whoever was there in this forest with her. It was only after she was sure the horse was long gone that she finally rose and continued her hunt for food. She spotted a wild hare lurking near the brook. She pulled out an arrow from her quiver and sent it careening from the bow, striking the hare on her first try. "Let's see perfect, dutiful Queen Eleanor do that," Merida said, retrieving her kill. However, cooking her dinner proved to be much more difficult than catching it. She dug a small hole in the ground and encircled it with rocks, then went about gathering twigs and kindling for a fire. She grabbed her bow and a sturdy stick and tried to remember the steps her father had taught her when it came to making a fire. She vigorously sawed the bow back and forth across the stick until finally, after half a dozen tries, a flame sparked. She had left home without a dagger, so she had to use the pointed tip of one of her arrows to skin and clean the hare. Sacrificing one of the arrows, she used it as a spit, slowly rotating it from above the flames to roast the animal. After what felt like an eternity, Merida was finally able to enjoy her dinner. The bland, gamey flavor made her appreciate the cooks of Castle Dunbrock even more. She would never complain about the single dish they had made ever again. But at least she had some food in her belly. She could be grateful for that. The sun had already set by the time she finished eating, and as much as she wanted to keep the fire going for both warmth and light, Merida knew better. Her father had taught her that the fire was a beacon for the enemy, and she had not forgotten about those men with the unfamiliar tartan, nor could she be sure that the person on horseback who had been near as she had been hunting would not return. She did not want to lead any unsavory company to her, especially when she felt so poorly. After securing Angus's reins, Merida wrapped her arms around her knees and leaned against a tree. Her head pounded, the knot near the temple still tender to the touch. Coupled with the exhaustion of the long, harrowing day, it made for an agonizingly rough night's sleep. The next morning, Merida awoke to the same throbbing headache, along with stiff shoulders and a pain at her side. She opened her eyes, then sucked in a swift breath. There was the gleaming blade of a deadly-looking dagger pointed directly at her face.